back to this common denominator that I think all of us listening today and all of us listening to the recording likely have. I think we're all trainers. Now, when I'm teaching this material live and I look out at my audience and say, who in the room is a trainer? Typically, not everybody raises his or her hand. And I'll look to somebody who doesn't raise her hand and say, I'm wondering what you might be doing in the audience. Why are you interested? And she'll maybe say, no, I only have my own pet dog. Well, we train our own dogs. I'm not saying this is just for professionals. It's for everybody who has contact with an animal whose behaviors we care about, right? You may not even be interested in teaching your dog anything new. You may say, I just want to preserve the good behaviors my dog already has. I want to maintain a good behavioral repertoire. I'm not interested in competing in anything or in doing new tricks. I just sort of like my dog's behaviors, and I want to make sure they don't degrade over time. Why would that be a concern? Behavior is variable. Behavior changes. We should all rejoice in that. It's our way in as trainers. If behavior was invariable, we wouldn't have a lot of opportunities to capitalize on that variability in behavior. That variability in behavior is part of our evolution. Our behavior varies as if we're doing little experiments in the environment to create a feedback loop, to create some consequences, some changes in the environment, and we then observe, either consciously or unconsciously, how did that work? How effective was my behavior? Was that little change in my behavior something that provided valuable feedback, an environmental change that I like? Or was that not so successful? I don't like the way the environment changed. So the fact that we all have evolved to have some variability in our behavior in order to create this feedback loop is an advantage to us trainers, right? So if we say all of us living with animals and caring about their behavior are actually training, let's just make sure we understand what training is. Right? So two different definitions on this slide. Training or teaching, right, is the consequential change of one organism's behavior by the actions of another organism. In this definition, we're saying, we're going to say that training or teaching is the intentional arrangement of consequences that we do as trainers or teachers. Now, you could argue the environment is passively teaching animals all the time. We don't need the intervention of a human teacher in order to have our learners, our animals learning, right? So let's say that training or teaching is when we're doing some intentional arrangement of consequences, okay? So training is, let's look at that second bullet point, controlling consequences to change probability of future behavior. Now, this definition of training is specifically looking at operant or Skinnerian conditioning. We're going to talk about that next. Now, we could go, there's other ways that we as trainers or teachers can effect some learning. We can create some learning. And we can do more than just control consequences. We can control antecedents. Stick with me if this is new wording for you. I'm going to explain this, I hope, clearly enough that you understand those words, consequences and antecedents. They're really important. I really want you to get a handle on both of them. But know that whether we're saying that training is controlling consequences, that's what we do most often. Or we say that training is sometimes controlling antecedents. We do that also in training. I'm going to detail these both for you. But in either case, I want you to see that we're controlling the environment. To do what? To change probabilities of our learner, our animal's future behaviors. We are not directly controlling our animal. We're controlling the environment surrounding our animal. That's how we have power. again, I'm going to just say that this good training or good teaching is actually an application of some laws of learning. We looked at the science to inform us. This is good news. So for a lot of my colleagues or students who will say, I chose animal training as a profession because I really like animals. I don't really like science. I want to just say the science, the bare minimum of the science that we need to make better choices is completely accessible to pretty much anyone. That's my job here, is to help make it clear to folks listening to this recording or attending this webinar. But to be able to say, you know what, I'm just not going to pay attention to that science. Remember, that's not fair to our learners. And again, I think the science makes it easier for us, not harder. I think it really limits how much time you're going to waste doing interventions that don't comply with the science, right? I feel like it's just a giant waste of time to go out there and try to fight gravity, right? Gravity is sort of a given in the physical world. It would be foolish to try to work against it. I think it's kind of foolish to work against the laws of learning. If we understand them, they're on our side, right? So I keep alluding to these choices that you as a trainer have to make, and I'm just putting all the bullet points that will fit on one PowerPoint slide and breaking all the good rules of PowerPoint. There's too many words on this slide, but I want you to have it in the recording to be mindful of these choices. So I've, in recent years, started to say to my colleagues and students, I want your choices to be more intentional. I want you to bring them to mind rather than let them be made unconsciously. Let me give you an example before I go to these bullet points here. I think it's become very common for trainers, at least in the United States and in other countries where I've taught, to maybe describe themselves as force-free. And I totally understand the humanity and goodwill behind that description. But I have some concerns about it because I, A, don't know that it's completely possible. I do understand that it's meant to say force-free trainers avoid using coercive tools, prong collars or shock collars or choke chains in their training. And it says a lot more than that too. I'm simplifying here. But here's another worry I have. It's a little more subtle. I'm afraid when we say that we're force-free, we aren't mindful of all the times we do use force in our training. And I think that everybody does. Now, it can be very mild. It can be quite infrequent. But I don't want to, in saying that label, make unconscious the times that I do tighten my dog's leash and compel him or her to come with me, or to go up and grab his collar nicely, saying hello, maybe even giving a treat, but to redirect him to come with me because you ignored my recall and I have to go to work, so I'm going to bring you in the house. I'm just saying, if you're not mindful that we all use force to some extent, and that the important choice to me is how often and in what situations you might use it. We'll come back to that later when we talk about the hierarchy of interventions. I know many of you are already familiar with Dr. Friedman's humane hierarchy, Dr. Friedman's humane hierarchy of choices of interventions in training. But we're going to have that slide later in this webinar, I hope, with Dr. Friedman's permission. And if you haven't heard of it, it's worth taking time to review it. I think it's an important part of our ethical responsibilities as trainers.